This is Captiva in Conversation, your space for impactful and psychologically safe dialogue. We turn internal discussions with our people into useful lessons for the wider world, all centred on your development and finding new ways to grow. Today's episode is all about imposter syndrome. So that feeling that you don't belong, aren't good enough, or that sooner or later someone's going to find you out. The term was first coined by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in 1978, when they noticed that even high achieving people often doubted their own success. Today, I'm really pleased that we're joined by two brilliant colleagues, Rebecca Scullion and Andy Wynter, each bringing a different lens to today's topic of choice. So, if we could just get you both to give a short introduction and background, please. Over to you first, Andy.
All right, let's do ladies first.
Over to you, Bex.
Okay, I am Rebecca, aka Bex. I come from a background of having worked in education for sadly it's something like over 20 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Wynter. My current role is Head of Progress and Performance, and I have a varied background in terms of different industries and sectors that I've worked in. So, yeah, started off in retail, went into energy, now in training. So, quite a varied, some might say, checkered past.
Fabulous. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today for this very first episode as part of our enrichment series. So first question then, and we'll go back to you, Bex, for this one first. When was the first time that you realised that you might be experiencing imposter syndrome, and what did it feel like?
Gosh, that's, you asking that question made me think, now that I know what imposter syndrome is, I can now look back over my past and think, okay, that first moment I walked into a university lecture hall, I now know that that was a massive sense of imposter syndrome, feeling like I was going to get caught out, feeling anxiety, feeling like I didn't fit in. But at the time, I didn't know that. I just thought I was insecure and I thought I just was stupid, basically. And I don't even know why I was in this room. But now, when I think back to my kind of leadership experience and kind of when I really knew, I suppose, that this was a thing, and imposter syndrome was a thing. I suppose it was walking into the first day of a job in a private school. I'd come from a state school experience. I'd got a very nice job in a very nice school with amazing people. But at the time, I just thought I was going to get found out, that I wasn't as smart as them. And there was a lot of very clever people from Oxford and Cambridge degrees, and I didn't have that level of degree. I was doing a grown-up job in a grown-up school and feeling very, very small. And basically, I just felt that I didn't fit in. I didn't feel that I belonged there. And I thought that basically somebody was going to look at where I'd got my degree from and basically not push me out, because they were a very nice bunch of people, but that I would feel so out of place that it wouldn't be right for me to stay there.
Wow. And did that feeling dissipate over a period of time?
Yes, there was one moment I remember having lunch with a colleague who I absolutely idolised. He was one of the cleverest men I'd ever met. And I sat there having lunch with him, I don't even know what the conversation was, but I remember that feeling. And I remember almost in my brain, the little bubble that came and said, Bex, you've just held your own with a conversation with X. And I'd never felt so proud of myself. I thought, no, I can fit in. I've just held my own on a conversation with this absolute, on a pedestal academic man that I just thought was amazing. And I did it.
Amazing. That's really good to hear. And I'm sure we'll delve into that more later on in this episode. Andy, in terms of your own initial thoughts on that question?
It's funny, when I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, actually, my imposter syndrome starts from probably when I was about 4 or 5, believe it or not. And as Beck says, you don't realize at the time. And actually, I blame my parents, and I'll tell you why. It's because, and anybody from a global majority heritage will understand this. One of the first things we were taught as kids of color, and a statement that was well known amongst the community, is you have to be twice as good to get to the same place. That that was just something that we were brought up with. That's something we were told from a very young age. And so you almost have that inbuilt imposter syndrome from day one because of that, because you have that inner feeling that actually, to be on a level playing field, you have to be twice as good. And so that feeling of being an imposter growing up in school was always there. You felt like you had to do more. And you said, Bex, about belonging. You sometimes felt in different environments that you didn't belong. Quite often growing up, I would be the only person of color in, say, a gymnastics class, which was really important to me, or sports class, which was really important to me. I would be the only person. And you grew up thinking, do I fit in here? Am I supposed to be in here? Am I good enough to be here? And that doesn't go as you grow and get into adulthood. I think that stays with you. Even today, there are situations and environments where I have that feeling of, actually, am I good enough to be here? So I blame my parents for embedding that from early age. But throughout my career, certainly, in senior positions, that feeling of insecurity, I guess, has always been there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. I think, just to bring that to my own perspective as well, I think it's really interesting, actually, because I've definitely felt imposter syndrome at numerous times throughout my career, not least of which recently with a new role starting and that kind of trepidation that goes with it. I think there's always an assumption sometimes that males can not necessarily feel imposter syndrome and that there's a typical confidence that comes with that. That's certainly not my lived experience. I think my own, again, upbringing, and we will touch on class a little bit later in terms of where certain opportunities present themselves, both from a kind of a cultural point of view, but also just actual the avenues and the doors that are open to individuals. I've definitely felt imposter syndrome at numerous points through perceptions around intelligence, as Bex has alluded to, perceptions around people being higher up in the food chain than me, perceptions around age-related imposter syndrome, so feeling like the youngest, most immature person in the room and therefore not feeling like I belong. So I think there's patterns here across the board, really, that really can have a detrimental impact on our own anxiety levels and our own feelings of belonging. Bex, were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I just really, I completely get what Andy's saying about that need to kind of feel like you're twice as good. And it's that, and I wish I could let that go. I really struggle with not working hard and doing the best I can, to often the point of it being distraction. And it's like I feel like I've always got to prove myself that I can work harder, that I can work the hardest, I will get the best results. And it almost kills me. And at what point does that balance out with well-being? Because in my brain, intellectually, I know that I need to let it go, but something inside intrinsically won't let it go, and it still drives me. And that, that showing up to the point of perfectionism and that drive to have to do things absolutely perfectly, I think sometimes it drives us too hard. There's a balance, isn't there? There's a point where there's probably a really nice, comfortable balance, and I wish I could find it, because I haven't found it yet. I still feel like I've got to not be the best, because I can't be the best at everything. That's arrogant to say that, but I have to work as hard as I can to be the best that I can, even if that almost means going too far and not looking after my own well-being. And it's something that I just can't change yet. Growth mindset.
Absolutely. No, I mean, thank you for your honesty there. I think it's such a poignant moment here to reflect on that, because we all have actually talked about our upbringings and actually how that shaped us, particularly those younger experiences and those moments in kind of childhood, adolescence, and actually how that shaped our approach to our own professional identity, our own personal identity, which essentially marries up into that imposter syndrome when it does sort of manifest. If we take that onto then what imposter syndrome is as a definition, often people will assume that it's just lacking confidence, but it's far deeper than that. So it's when that success doesn't feel earned, even when there's clear evidence of achievement. And there's research out there, which we will signpost as part of our resources that will go on our Canvas pages, that actually up to 70% of people experience these feelings at some point during their career. And often when we're coaching and mentoring apprentices, certainly at the beginning of their particular apprenticeship journey, imposter syndrome is always a key phrase that comes up. And then when we come full circle towards the end of their apprenticeship, and actually they've recognized their value and the impact that they have, Imposter syndrome is another topic that we talk about in terms of being able to put that to bed and recognizing one's own value. So a couple of questions here for you, really. How do you feel that imposter syndrome typically shows up within your professional working environment? And what are some of those misconceptions that you've seen around your own experiences around imposter syndrome? I'm going to come to you first again, Bex, if that's okay.
Well, I always feel like I'm going to get found out that I don't know enough. And again, I think that goes back to that intellectual insecurity that I might have. How does it also show up? I know that I overwork to compensate. Again, that's something that I've mentioned that I can't seem to shift. And I think any praise that I ever get, I think I also dismiss it or try and justify it or belittle it. And that's not just a work thing. I think that's a personal thing. And I also think it's a woman thing. If somebody offers a compliment or a praise, it's very easy to dismiss it or trying to almost play it down. And I think sometimes I need to own praise. Not that I get it that often, but when you do get it, I'm very quick to dismiss it or just kind of not really go with it. So I think that's probably how it shows up mainly for me at the
Brilliant.
moment.
Thank you so much, Bex. Andy?
No, it's interesting, particularly in the environment that we work in, which you could class as education. The imposter syndrome can come in terms of what qualification you've got, and certainly, joining the organisation. Yes, I had a degree. I didn't get my degree until very late on in life. I was in my 30s, and up until that point, I guess there was an educational imposter syndrome for me in terms of was I good enough to do a degree and get a degree. But even having got that and knowing internally that I was quite knowledgeable about leadership and other things, I still felt I needed to go that step further. And certainly when I started getting involved in the EDI side of things and the unconscious bias side of things, I actually really did start feeling an imposter. It was like, and eventually somebody's going to stand up and say, well, what makes you qualified to talk about unconscious bias or EDI? And so I went to the extent of actually sort of almost eliminating that potential question by actually getting a master's in that subject. But that was as a large result of me feeling like an imposter and having to give myself that additional credibility. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but maybe some of the motive behind wanting to do that was within that imposter syndrome. And even though I haven't delivered my workshops any differently, I feel more confident and it's eliminated some of that imposter syndrome that I have. But I always have that nagging feeling that somebody is going to find me out and say, do you know what, you're talking a load of nonsense here, and this is why. But
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, certainly when I stepped out of the mainstream education sector and joined Captiva Learning, there was a huge period of imposter syndrome as you are presented with lots of new acronyms, lots of new learning, lots of new processes, and that there was a real period of self-doubt. And I think it's that sort of assumption that we always have to appear confident or always have to appear capable, which then can make it really hard to admit feelings of vulnerability, particularly in a professional workspace where sometimes we don't know people within our professional workspace that well. I know for me, imposter syndrome often sort of manifests or presents itself in that I believe everybody else is right in a professional meeting and that my opinion isn't necessarily as valid as those around the table, whether that's the physical table or a virtual table, due to those feelings of not belonging, of actually not having earned my place at the table. And I think it's really interesting then that idea that imposter syndrome can show up differently depending on our backgrounds and our upbringings, but actually that emotion, those feelings are universal. So just as a kind of follow-up question then, how do you both feel that the context, i.e. gender, race, culture or class, can affect who feels like they belong? I'm going to come to you first on that one, Andy, because I know you've already touched on that a little bit.
I think it does, because I think society has a part to play as well, because those stereotypes, that messaging that sometimes goes out can actually enhance that feeling of imposter syndrome. If you think of young black boys in particular who sometimes see that stereotype of being lazy or being aggressive or being in trouble or not being as academic. That can feed into that imposter syndrome that they have in later life, and feeling again that they don't belong at Oxford University, they don't belong in at Eton and stuff like that. It's not a place where black boys, black girls go. So that can build in for those who can achieve those levels. They feel that they're not in a position to do that. So I think society has a really big part to play in helping eliminate some of these feelings of being an imposter, feeling not belonging. And some of the stuff that's gone on recently, I think that feeds into that belief that people feel they don't belong because of what others are saying. So I think there's a societal issue around imposter syndrome as well.
Thank you so much, Andy. And Beck, same question for you, please.
Gosh, it's really hard to take it away from that societal thing that Andy's just mentioned, because I think imposter syndrome does come back, emotionally to that sense of belonging, and it then follows up with not being good enough. I had a very transient childhood, shall we say, where I always had, even though I moved throughout various schools, etc., I always didn't have the accent that fitted in for various reasons. And then I went to university and I didn't feel I fitted in there. Then when I went into leadership, I had the qualifications, I had the experience, I had the role, yet I still didn't feel like I fitted in because I was female then. So there always seems to be something that makes you feel or questions your validity of being in that group, in that sector. And working in senior leadership, okay, the balance is shifting. The stats are out there for women in leadership. But in certain sectors and certain subject areas, I was computing and ICT. As a female, we were in the minority. As a senior leader in the independent sector, I would say that women were, when I first joined the big conferences, I was in the minority. And I didn't know whether people were talking to me because they found me interesting or because I happened to be a minority, for a token female in a group discussion. So I never knew whether I was being included because I was female or because I was worthy.
And that's such an interesting point that we could spend the rest of this session unpicking. I think what that really alludes to, Bex, is that idea of systemic bias, and that idea that actually imposter syndrome can sometimes be evidenced or exemplified or magnified by the constant signals within the environment that we're working within that almost forces to question our competence. Is that something that either of you have had experience on, Andy?
I guess it does, and we talk about unconscious bias. So unconsciously, I think it does. I don't think consciously that is something that I'm thinking about all the time. I think it's an unconscious mindset, and as I say, that's reinforced by what we see and hear every day. That feeds that bias.
And Bex, is that again something you've mentioned already? That idea of feeling like you've got to be that perfectionism that kind of exists. Is that something that you have noticed within your own experience if you look back over your career?
Yes, and I think, again, sweeping generalizations, I've seen that more with other senior leaders that are female. I've seen that desire for perfectionism. I'm not saying that males don't experience it or other people don't feel that they've got to overwork. I'm saying it's something that I feel like I've seen a lot of. But slightly changing that, what I feel is also I have a responsibility to play in changing that. So on good days when I'm not feeling like an imposter and I feel grr, actually what I feel like is just working with a senior leader the other day, I feel like I'm wanting to empower her to say, come on, get your grr on, let's do this. Let's show them that you are capable. Let's get rid of that imposter syndrome. And you feel like you're trying to almost debunk those kind of stereotypes and myths through the work that we're now doing. And that's, people have often challenged me about why I've left education and moved into the world of apprenticeships. And I just feel like, we're all having power still. I'm just now working with senior leaders and trying to help them be the best versions of themselves so that they can either tackle their own kind of imposter syndromes, but also show the world what they're made of. That's what I want to do now.
And yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting one because, again, there's been times where I've been in a room professionally, even to the point of personally, actually, because it does exist in the personal sphere as well, where people come across as really confident and really competent within those experiences, and you wonder, how are you doing that? How are you able to sort of present this persona, and then actually, once I've got to know them slightly better throughout my tenure with them, actually there's huge imposter syndrome there. So it's a really interesting phenomenon in terms of how people react to it, because I think imposter syndrome is so ultimately complicated because it is tapped into our emotions and our upbringing and our cultural backgrounds and the things that we've already discussed. Therefore, there's a myriad of ways that it can present itself. I mean, as I said previously, my mantra, my take on it is almost to be a bit of a yes person and just agree with the people in the room, and because they definitely know more than I do. How would you say that you both present in terms of imposter syndrome? Bex, I'll come to you first on that, if that's okay.
Do you know, that's a really good question. I don't know how I show up with imposter. I feel it. How does it manifest? I probably ask a lot of questions that I think are really daft questions. And I probably always apologize for asking obvious and dumb questions. And actually, they're probably not dumb questions. They're just questions. And I shouldn't almost try and justify or oversimplify things by saying, oh, this is a new girl question, or this is a silly question. So I probably ask too many questions and try and belittle why I'm asking them. I might also appear overconfident as I try to battle it. I remember standing in front of, when we used to do CPD for staff, I'd be standing in front of 150 staff delivering a session. And inside, I'm literally doubting myself, not quite to the point of being sick at the side of the theatre, but certainly going through what the hell do you know, Bex sort of territory. And then at the end, everyone says, oh, how great you are. There's probably that balance when imposter syndrome, you have to work twice as hard and then show up extra confident. And it certainly wasn't how I was feeling.
Thank you so much, Bex. That definitely resonates with my own experience as well.
It's funny because it really depends on who's in the room, doesn't it? Your imposter syndrome shows up differently depending on the situation. I mean, sometimes when you've been in the room, Dame, you come across as the person of knowledge, and there's no sense that you would be having any sort of imposter syndrome there. And I'm sure there's situations where I'm in the room where people think exactly the same about me. So I think it depends on the circumstances and the people in the room, because I think imposter syndrome is as much around the people in the room and how they make you feel as how you feel internally yourself. And that goes back to what I was saying about other people having a responsibility in terms of not eliminating imposter syndrome, but recognizing that it is something that people have and making those situations easier for you. And I think certainly within our organization, and we talk about it all the time, the psychological safety element, which, if you want to paraphrase that, is the ability to look stupid, sound stupid, and not really get penalized for that in any way. I think, when you can create those type of environments, then imposter syndrome becomes less important and less of a thing. And I think, certainly in our organization, in certain situations, I feel that I can be stupid and say stupid stuff without people thinking I'm stupid. So and I think that's really important.
No, that's brilliant. And actually moves us perfectly onto our kind of final segment here in terms of how do we actually, as individuals, but also as organizations, look to overcome imposter syndrome. And those feelings of imposter syndrome, those feelings of self-doubt, those feelings of not belonging or actually not being worthwhile of that success. What techniques, what helps us when those thoughts or feelings appear? I'm going to come to you for aspects, if that's okay.
So my mum, as I'm sure every mum or parent has ever kind of indicated, used to have the mantra, you get back from life what you put in. And if I'm struggling with imposter syndrome and I'm feeling unworthy of just about to go on stage and deliver some CPD, I think there's a stern word to be had with oneself. That is, you have done the work, Bex. You've done your prep. You know your stuff. And it is literally having a stern word with yourself. In an ideal world, I think it's also great if you have managed to capture a soundbite from somebody else that can also validate that. And so for once, and when I was struggling at the beginning of a deputy headship, my head told me, literally both arms on the shoulder, Bex, you are here for a reason. You are here because you are the best person for the job. Don't ever forget that. And so that soundbite is needed to be replayed maybe a few times as you approach that moment of self-doubt. And then from a purely kind of, is it imposter syndrome, or is it just when the chips are down and I'm feeling really yucky about, sometimes in leadership, jobs are not always glossy, fun and smiley. And there's some hard bits to it. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this. I have a little drawer next to me, and in that drawer are cards that either students or colleagues have sent me. And if ever I'm feeling like I don't belong, or I don't matter, or my work doesn't matter, I pick up a card and I have a read, and again, have a quiet word with myself.
And hopefully a kind, quiet word with yourself, Bex.
Yes, kind. Yes, no, it is kind. It's not kind. It's not aggressive. It's not beating myself up. It's just reminding yourself that you are enough. You were appointed for a reason, and others do value that. And sometimes your own narrative and your own voice, the volume is up very loud and it can kind of go over everything else that's being said. But sometimes we just need to turn the volume up on the other voices that have had, an impact previously.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. I think sometimes we absolutely downplay actually how we're seen by others. And I think that's actually so important. It's possibly more important in terms of certain sectors that you work within, actually recognizing the impact and the value that you have on those around you, because ultimately that's your job. But we sometimes dismiss that and go back to that negativity. So that's a really powerful point, Bex. Thank you. And the same question for you then, please. What would you advise in terms of doing or behaving or acting when those thoughts or feelings do appear?
I also have a drawer which is filled with biscuits. And I do a lot of comfort eating. And certainly in terms of sometimes when you feel you're not good enough, that's what you tend to do. I don't do it so much now. But on a serious note, I think there's a few things. I think the first thing, and similar to what Bex was saying there, having a critical friend, I think, is really beneficial. Someone who is your go-to person, who you can actually talk through some of the imposter syndrome things that you have in your daily and weekly life. Somebody who is a critical friend will tell you when perhaps you should go one way when you wanted to go another. I think that's really important as well. And it's good to have that person, and that can help with that. But also as well, having people around you who reinforce the fact that you are good enough. I mean, I'm fortunate in being a person of faith as well, and I strongly believe that you are where you're meant to be, and you're put there because you are good enough, and because you have value and you've got things that you can offer other people. So that helps me as well. But I also think there's something around, and Bex talked about health and well-being earlier, and I think those are two important aspects in terms of eliminating imposter syndrome. As you probably know, one of the things I've started doing recently is going out for walks, and that has had a massive impact on my mental health, and just having that quiet opportunity, which we don't give ourselves, I don't think, that time to just think things through on our own. Think about what you're doing in life. Think about the job that you're doing, your interactions with people, and having just that space and time on your own, doing a walk really helps. Apart from the physical strength of that as well, and I think there is an element around being physically well that helps with that mental thing, and then helps with the imposter syndrome. So I think all of those things, which might seem a bit outside of imposter syndrome, but actually can have a real impact on how you feel about yourself as an individual. I think that's what I've certainly taken from what I've been doing, not just recently, but over a while, to make sure that I have less imposter syndrome.
That's really good to hear. Thank you, Andy. I think for me personally, it's actually that reframing what success is, and possibly more importantly, not being afraid of failure. That has often been the biggest source of my imposter syndrome, is that interpretation or perspective of failing within my role. and actually not seeing failure as the ultimate no-no, but actually as part of a learning process, and not evidence that you don't belong, but actually evidence that you're brave and courageous enough to try new things and recognize that all people don't succeed fully at all points throughout their role, I think is a really interesting point. I think it's also to recognize that other people within your working environment are also suffering with imposter syndrome and therefore presenting in a slightly different way. It goes back to points you made earlier, Andy, around that psychological safety. Well, that only happens when people are open enough to say, I'm not feeling great in this scenario, or I'm really doubting myself about this particular plan or this particular strategy. But that does take a real thought process from everyone involved in actually setting that cultural tone and making sure that we're really clear on actually being psychologically safe with one another and building each other up, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. That idea of kind of shared challenges and shared ownership of these things, I think is vitally important and hugely powerful. So just as we're kind of wrapping up here, then there's a part kind of reflection point. And Bex, I'm going to come to you first again. Quite a big question. What do you wish someone had told you earlier about belonging, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome?
What do I wish someone had told me earlier? I think I was probably told it, but I didn't hear it. So I probably was told very early on that you are enough, you are good enough. But did I hear those words? Probably not. So I think having that culture, or having that genuine belief that you are enough, that you do belong, that you can fit in, I wish I'd heard it earlier, not that someone had told me earlier. And I think, I know whenever you're in a room with experienced professionals, or you're in a room with other people, that everyone's got their insecurities. Mine was always education. I'd gone to a very large state school, and I spent most of my secondary school trying to hide, basically, to the point where I was told BSET girls don't do A levels, and that was a gender thing, and it was an average thing. And I wish someone had told me earlier not to listen to those voices. Don't let anyone define you.
Love that. Thank you, Bex. That's amazing. Andy?
I think earlier I would have liked to have been told, but I'll tell you a story. I think I've told it before. When I used to work for one of my retail organizations, Titles Video, they had a massive event, video of the year event, and my area manager at the time decided to take me. I was a manager of a store, which was great in itself, actually, him wanting to take me to this event. And I always remember him saying, as we pulled up to the NEC, and there were like Mercedes and BMWs and Jaguars, and at the time I was driving a battered Ford Chevette. And I remember the conversation I had with him, and he was talking about all these different cars, and he turned around to me and he said, "Don't you worry, Andy," he said, "you'll have one of these before long." And it was a real encouragement, because what he was saying was not that I was going to be able to get a car, but he had that confidence in me that I was going to be able to advance to a position where I would be able to afford a car like that. And that really gave me a massive sense of encouragement at that particular time. Which and there have been people throughout my life who said similar things, but I wish I'd had it earlier on, I would say. And it brings me to there was a woman called Marion Elderman, and she's like the founder of the Children's Defence Fund, and she works with children from marginalized communities. And one of the things that she's well known for in saying is that if you can see it, you can be it. And I think that again goes back to that society thing, and having role models, having people in positions of power. And so where you can see it, you believe you can get it. And in America, where with Barack Obama becoming president, and that was a massive boost for young black kids, seeing that actually as somebody said, you're going from really the depths of slavery to president, shows that the ability for people to achieve is there if the will is there, and you've got that society support as well. So for me, it's those things. It's having people walking alongside you, walking with you, but also being able to see success in people who are you as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate that sentiment, and Bex as well. Just, yeah, beautifully put from both of you. And if we bring it now to kind of our closing and key takeaways, it's been a phenomenal session, actually really, really enjoyable. And I hope our listeners have had some thought-provoking ideas and follow-up points. To summarize, it's that idea that your difference is actually your strength, and that you are bringing to the table perspectives that other people may not have. Recognize that everybody doubts themselves, even those that you admire the most. That vulnerability builds trust and is absolutely not a weakness. Imposter syndrome can thrive in silence. So when we talk about it, we actually take back its power. We need to recognize that, as Andy's alluded to, representation and mentorship matter. So find people who do reflect your journey. Reframe that idea that I was mentioning earlier around failure as growth and learning, and not the be all and end all, because often there's a spectrum of success and failure, and will often fit somewhere along those lines at some point in time. Talk about it. Confidence isn't that absence of doubt. It's about recognizing and seeing that doubt, but moving forward anyway, and sharing those challenges with those people around you. And finally, remember that you've earned your place on that table, whether it's a physical or virtual one. You belong there, and you need to trust in yourself. Use that inner voice that Bex talked about earlier, and really start to build yourself up and start to see those successes for what they are. But huge thanks to our guests today, Andy Wynter and Rebecca Scullion. Brilliant insights. Join us next time for our November session, where we'll be exploring career progression and skills development. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and have a great rest of the week when you get there.